Hello and welcome to another subtraction session. It's Nell, Derek, Debevoise Dewey, Nell 3D to friends, and I'm thrilled to be here with Sonja Lyubomirsky. Thank you, Sonja, for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Great to talk to you today.
Likewise. And Sonja, along with her co-author Harry Reese, have a fascinating book that I devoured coming through, very timely for Love Month. I had to come in red, called How to Feel Loved. And so, given our, theme here of subtraction, I'm going to start with Sonia, what if we subtracted feeling loved?
It's actually a great question to start with because after decades of research on happiness, I'm a happiness scientist. Harry, my collaborator, is a love scientist. We have a great collaboration. I realized that really the key to happiness is feeling loved, and I can kind of back up and say more about that. So if you subtract feeling loved, you basically everyone's going to be less happy. You could also think about loneliness, like a moment of loneliness is really a moment when you don't feel loved, right? You feel like you don't belong, you don't matter to someone, or more than one person. And so again, it's like it means loneliness. It means not unhappiness when you don't have feeling love. Feeling loved is really critical for happiness. And you can go back to like evolutionary theory, this idea that like when you don't feel loved, it's a signal. It's an evolutionary signal that something is wrong. We need to maybe repair relationships. We need to like something wrong with our social bonds. And we had to survive. Like we needed those social bonds in our ancestral past to survive, to like find mates, to literally to survive. And so that's why it feels so aversive, right? It almost feels like dying when we're not loved.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
beautiful. Gosh, that's great framing. I love that. And I love how that deepens it raises the stakes, right? It's
Mhm.
not just this kind of like woo woo, like I want to be happy or like my twin flame or, that kind of version. It's like, no, no, this is like existential, right? When you touch loneliness or
Totally. And
survival.
and also feeling loved. Remember, love we define very broadly, right? So it's not just about romantic love. Of course, lots of people are going to read the book, I think, thinking about their romantic partners, which is great. But it's also love of of your neighbor, your colleague, your family member, mom, daughter, best friend. So, it all matters, right?
Yeah, I love that. The premise here is leading in 3D, right? And so this notion of me, love, self-love, we, and that is family and colleagues. I posted something, the article says, like, what is a way to romance your colleague? Not in a creepy, like HR preventative way, but in a loving way. Yeah.
I love that so much because like one point which we make in the book, and I often talk about, is that we don't use the word love enough in the workplace. Like, and we should, like, absolutely. Like there are definitely colleagues that I love and they love me, and that it's beautiful, right? And actually, I also think we should say I love you to many more people than just our child or our romantic partner. So yeah, another kind of topic of conversation, but I
Cool.
think that's
Yeah,
important.
we'll get
Yeah.
there. So before we get into the specifics of it and the five frameworks and everything, the premise that you and Harry come to is that feeling loved is actually in our own control. And I imagine, and I think we've shared, you're finding some resistance to
Yeah.
that.
Well, I think I actually I think once we make the point and sort of explain, I think people like are really happy to hear it. And
Mhm.
so this idea is that usually, by the way, when we've done surveys, most people say that they don't feel loved or don't feel loved enough in at least one relationship in their life. So almost everyone can sort of identify, yeah, like yeah, my maybe I want to feel a little bit more loved by my adult child or my dad or my colleague or friend. Anyway, so when you think about like what do people do when they don't feel loved, or loved enough, like they think, well, I need to sort of somehow change myself. I need to make myself more lovable. Like if only the other person kind of knew or saw, how wonderful I am, right? That like it's like that's what we do when we meet each other, right? Like I'm meeting you for the first time, right? I want you to think that I'm kind and interesting and smart and funny and virtuous. And so we sort of try to impress each other. So that's what we usually try to do is like, I want to make myself more lovable. Or you think like, I need to change the other person somehow, like need to get them to love me more, right? Which is not really in our control. And
Mm.
so we found out this is after 7 years of work on this book, Harry and I spent many years working on it. Is that it's really actually a very empowering message that you don't need to change yourself. You don't need to change the other person. What you need to do is to change the conversation. And that seems so much more manageable, right? And when you could think of a relationship really as a series of conversations. And
Mm.
so start with the first one, the second one, the third one, and sort of how you approach your conversations with the other person is what matters. So that's really much very much in your control.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's right. At first, it's like, it's not my fault that no one loves me. There's that kind of like
Yeah.
defense response.
Yeah.
But actually, I can change the conversation, and you have such tangible, we'll get to the really tangible tips you have for that, rather than trying to like, yeah, be more beautiful or
Yeah.
more approachable or whatever. Um, and so you kind of alluded to it, but 7 years is a long time, and you have these kind of adjacent but complementary backgrounds of studying happiness in your case and love in Harry's. How did this finally kind of come to be to where you were like, oh, this is the message and this is important and urgent for people to
Yeah.
hear in this context?
I mean, Harry and I met, actually, we met 20 years ago. I mean, we've been, I mean, we were aware of each other's sort of work as colleagues, but we really started talking about 20 years ago at conferences. And it's interesting because like love scientists and relationship scientists, I mean, sorry, love scientists and happiness scientists don't really talk to each other that much. I mean, it's not like we don't like each other, but we should talk to each other more. And so that's what we realized. And so I've been doing all this work on happiness interventions, right? So studying kind of what makes people happier by doing basically clinical trials, but instead of testing like a vaccine, we're testing a happiness practice like gratitude or kindness. Um, and after all these decades, we started in 1998 pioneering these interventions. So after like 25 years, I like it hit me one day that sort of all of these interventions, like the interventions that work to make us happier, the reason they work is they make us feel more connected to or loved by others, right? So when you think about like when you write a gratitude letter to your best friend or your mom, it makes you feel more loved by them, right? When you
Yeah.
do an act of kindness for your colleague or neighbor, right? It makes you feel closer to them. Now,
Yeah.
you can argue that maybe some happiness practices like going on a run, doesn't necessarily have to do with connection, but almost all of them do. And
Mm.
then meanwhile, Harry is doing research on what he calls responsiveness, or how do we have conversations basically that we make each other feel understood and cared for and appreciated, which is also about really feeling loved. And so, yeah, so we kind of like realized like, wow, like we think the key to happiness is feeling loved. And then like the next step is like, how do we help people feel more loved?
Yeah,
Yeah.
gorgeous. So
Yeah.
we'll get there, and I want to back into it through the example. You share such a beautiful
Uh,
story of your experience with art, I believe, in relationship and how he was so good at making you feel loved.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. Like, yeah. So I had, and there's lots of people, I guess I
Yeah.
could talk about, but yeah. So one person who was a romantic partner who just was like so, just like the best listener in the world, I guess. And actually that's one thing that we talk about is well, we had mentioned how it's empowering, right? The book is empowering. And one way it's empowering is that a little bit counterintuitively, like if I want to feel more loved, then the first thing I should try to do is make the other person feel more loved
Mm,
first,
mm,
which is like a little counterintuitive, but that's really the first step. And so Art was so like he basically was like the best listener in the world. Like was so curious about me, like always like remembering everything I ever said and where I was sitting, where I sat and what I was wearing when I said it, right? Imagine how compelling that is, right? Like think about the last time that someone was so curious about you, right? And so that's really the first step is to show curiosity in the other person, is to really want like I really want to know about your inner life and or even the details of your day. Some people will like go on and on about like their details of the day. They'll be like, "Oh, I ran this errand and I couldn't find parking," and it's kind of boring, right, to listen to them. But it makes you realize like people really want others to kind of know what's going on with them, like even the minor details, which is maybe why people post on social media, right, what they had for breakfast. Yeah, I mean, I try not to do that, but anyway, so the idea is that like if I'm really curious, and you have to like feel genuine curiosity, like you can't
mm,
fake it. Find something in the other person that you're really curious about, their life story or what they're thinking about right now, their work, and then ask them about it. And then when they start talking, like really listen, not try to just like rehearse your answer, the next thing you're gonna say, but really listen. Where most of us are not very good listeners, including myself. Anyway, so Art was someone who was just an amazing listener. And then when you do that, the other person will open up and share, because one of the kind of like the key really to feeling loved is to first be known and really truly know the other. And so how do we do that? How do we really know each other? Because we
mm,
all have kind of walls around us. So it's really not that easy to get to know each other. And so if I show genuine curiosity in you, is going to help you open up, right, a little bit, show me more of your full self.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be your deepest secrets or traumas, right? Because pacing is really important. And then you'll reciprocate. Reciprocity is a very powerful rule of social behavior. And then ideally you'll reciprocate and then show curiosity in me and listen to what I say, and then I will, then I will open up. And so then we'll get to know each other better. In a
Yeah.
way, being known is the key.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, we started with this kind of frame of what if we subtracted feeling
Yeah.
loved as a way into the conversation. Obviously, I think we can all agree your research proves we don't want to do that because we'd
Yeah.
be really lonely and isolated and not evolve and survive. So let's not do that. What are we really subtracting? I've heard like that kind of peacocking that we do, the
Yeah.
fake listening. Like
Yeah.
what is most important to
Yeah.
subtract to feel more loved?
Right, right. Well, first of all, yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking another way to think about it is that if we're not known, right? If we subtract
Hmm.
being known to one another, which is like if we all just walk around with these walls around us and we never really see into each other, that would mean that we're never really feeling understood and loved. So that's one way to think about it. But I think you're talking about kind of what's something negative we can subtract. And
Yeah.
so that gets to we have a chapter in the book about kind of myths about feeling loved. Although actually we called them first myths, and then our editor thought that was a little too negative. So I think we're just calling them kind of like if only beliefs. Like if only I. So those are the myths. These beliefs are basically like we think that if only you knew how wonderful I am. Like if only I were more successful. And these are kind of these extrinsic goals that actually happen to be associated with unhappiness. Money, fame, popularity, status, beauty, power, right? So like if only I had more of those things, then
Yeah.
I would be more loved. So that's one thing to subtract, right? Is sort of these extrinsic goals. And most of us kind of are aware that those aren't like really the best goals to follow. And yet we still do. Like I
They're
still
strong
think
wired, right? I mean,
I still, yeah, exactly. Like I still want to be more beautiful and powerful and have more money. Like it's hard to sort of completely delete that. And then we also want to hide our shortcomings and weaknesses and flaws, completely human, completely natural. Or we think people won't like us if we show them our weaknesses, but actually counterintuitively, like that's actually wrong. Like of course you don't want to sort of dump all your weaknesses onto someone else, especially when you first met. But if we hide anything negative about us, right? If we only share the other person, like again, we are just meeting today for the first time. Like if I only share with you my like positive, kind of the tip of myself, right? The positive qualities, like you might be impressed, but it's not going to forge a connection, right? It's
mhm.
not going to. And when you think about like a first date or a first meeting with a professional colleague, that's what happens. So if I hide anything negative, it's not going to forge a connection. And one reason is if I want to feel loved by someone and they don't know really anything about me other than sort of the highlights, that I'll always wonder, right? Like, would they still love me if they knew this thing
Uh,
about me, or,
uh-huh.
or just they knew me better, Because all of us are kind of like a quilt of both positive and negative qualities, right? And so, yeah, so that's another thing to subtract is kind of this idea that like I have to hide all of my shortcomings or I
Mhm.
won't be loved.
Mhm. Love that.
Yeah.
So come to work a little bit because I think we do, as you said, it's not totally comfortable. Sometimes it's even kind of felt like a faux pas or like illegal or sanctionable to say, much less feel or express love at work. But what do you and Harry see and know from your research?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I just think it sounds like a cliche that sort of love is the answer. Love is the key to happiness. It's a cliche because almost all powerful ideas, like once you kind of distill them into like one word, they seem like they seem trite. Um, yeah, because feeling love, well, feeling, and you can think about it as again, loved in a broad sense. Feeling loved means, feeling understood, feeling valued, say by your colleagues. And that's like really, really critical, at work, right? You're going to be much better worker, right? You're going to help each other more, right? You're going to be a better organizational citizen if have ththese feelings at work. And there's research that shows that, right?
Mhm.
That like feelings of, and again, feelings of love. My colleague Barb Fredrickson at UNC Chapel Hill, she talks about what's that? Basically they're like moments of love or like love drops. So you can think of it as like a moment where you kind of feel love with someone. It could be a stranger, right? We've had this experience where like it's strange. You somehow suddenly you kind of understand each other for like one moment, right? You see something, you look at each other, and it's like a drop of love. Like I think she calls it like a drop of love, and I love that idea. Why don't we have more of these drops of love, in our day?
Yeah.
Similarly, we also talk about
Huh.
loneliness, like lonely and feelings of not being loved as like moments too. Like
Mm,
so we don't sort of essentialize them. So it's not like, oh, I'm just like a person who doesn't feel loved, or I'm a lonely person, which makes you feel like it's a trait or it's part of your identity or it's sort
mhm,
of like pervasive. But think about it as like a moment, like I'm having a
mhm.
lonely moment. I'm having a moment where I'm not feeling loved right
Right.
now because that
And so
makes it,
this, like to
yeah,
make it really concrete, this
yeah,
might be, I'm picturing I'm in a meeting with two colleagues and somebody brings something up and the other kind of snaps, right? This happened, it was a week or two ago. And I can see both scenario, right? I see what the person was bringing up. It was kind of this slightly new, different idea, and I see the person who snapped and their reaction. And I imagine I know, I might not know, but I imagine I know where that snap came from because there was a
yeah.
previous incident that it kind of triggered. And so I kind of said, interesting, and kind of resurrected the suggestion. And I mentioned, I'm curious about this because we had this other thing. Is that kind of a little bit of a love at work?
Beautiful. Yes, beautiful, beautiful.
Cool.
And it actually is one of the mindsets. So we talk about five mindsets that it's important to inhabit or embrace, if you want to feel more loved. And one of them is actually maybe even my favorite. It's called
Yeah.
multiplicity. And this is exactly what you were embracing during that moment. And multiplicity is this idea that we're all, I kind of already mentioned it, we're all kind of like a quilt of both positive and negative qualities or behaviors. And I'm kind sometimes, but sometimes I'm selfish and sometimes I'm loyal and sometimes I'm narcissistic, and we're all like that, right? We're all like that. And so to see another person's behavior in this sort of context of like we're all kind of messy, we all have triggers, and like not letting one trait or one behavior define them, right? I can imagine someone else being like, if someone snaps and then like you just, yeah, like you like, I don't like that person, like I'm just gonna avoid that person. This is not a good, right? Not a good strategy.
Yeah.
Although it's difficult. I feel like as we get older, it's sort of easier to see people to be less judgmental. Because getting back to
Mhm.
evolutionary psychology, I think it's maybe adaptive to be judgmental. We want to kind of make decisions like who's our
It's
friend
that
and who's our enemy.
sorting kind of mechanism, right?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so we are kind of judgmental. But the multiplicity mindset helps us be less judgmental to kind of be like, okay, let's think about where that history, what's the history of that comment?
Yeah.
Why did that person do that thing? And what explanation can we make? Doesn't mean we condone it. And sometimes like we don't even want to maybe hang out with that person, but we just sort of understand them better.
Right.
So and the reason multiplicity is important because when I talk about like really getting to know each other, some of
Mhm.
that process involves getting to know maybe some things that's uncomfortable for you or something that's a little bit negative. And so kind of recognizing their humanity, like really accepting them for who they are. It's really a gift, right? To have that attitude towards someone.
Yeah,
Yeah.
gorgeous.
Yeah.
I don't want to ruin the whole book because I know everyone's
Yeah.
going to go out and
Yeah, right,
buy
right, right.
it.
Yeah.
But there are these five really specific
Yeah.
things. And so multiplicity is one that we got into. Share maybe your second favorite.
Yeah, I think my second favorite is sharing.
Mhm.
Maybe because I'm good at sharing, better at sharing than listening. But it is important to share. Like again, as I was saying, I'm not going to feel loved if I'm not known, right? If I have this wall around me and no one really knows me,
Mhm.
it's really hard to be loved. There's one exception, I think. You could feel loved by a young child, and
Mhm.
they don't really know you, right? Like as an adult.
Interesting.
Yeah, kind of interesting. I was thinking about that. But anyway, so yeah, and then sharing, it's hard to share. You really need emotional intelligence
Yeah.
for actually all of these things. I often say like I wish that every high school had like emotional intelligence classes. And it's not easy to teach either because it's like you just have to be attuned to all these different signals, right? It's like all these social signals. And so if I want to share with you, something, and but you start small, right? Pacing is really important. And
Mhm.
so you might ask me, how was your day? And instead of saying fine, which is what we usually do, like really 90% of the time, um, maybe I say a little bit more. Maybe I say, oh, I had kind of a rough morning, And it doesn't have to be that, it doesn't have to be negative actually. Or I say, I saw this movie, everyone loves this movie, but I actually didn't like it. Like, so it's like, say your kind of true opinion about something, which is not always easy, right? If
Yeah.
it's like different from everyone else. And so, yeah, so you start small and then you kind of like share a little bit more. But you gauge the other person's response and the
Mm.
other person's interest, right? Because, right, like they might kind of be looking at you and they look like they're interested, but they're not really interested. And then you don't want to necessarily share that much more. Or maybe you want to ask the other person questions. My sort of second favorite, which is part of really the listening and curiosity mindsets, is asking people questions.
Uh,
Because I think we don't do that enough. Like it actually research shows that we think it'll be kind of awkward or uncomfortable to ask another person kind of deeper questions. And by deep,
mhm.
I don't mean your biggest secrets, but just more about like your personal life.
Yeah.
And yet, on average, we want to be asked those questions, right?
Yeah.
Like we want to be seen and heard.
Yeah. What's
So,
a good mid-level there of not like, what's your
yeah,
biggest regret or like,
yeah,
something really deep, but also not like, how
yeah.
was your coffee?
No, no,
What
great.
what's like, what are some good
It's a
examples?
great question. By the way, there's all kinds of like, I know that you probably know, all kinds of like question decks
The
you can buy and
best.
stuff.
Yeah.
Actually, there's one that's my favorite. It's called The And, like AND, and they have really great questions. I mean, they're
Okay.
all kinds of it. So, and I actually use these as slides sometimes when I give talks. I'll like present a slide of questions. That's like the slide that everyone wants to take a photo of.
The phones come
Um,
out.
I
Yeah.
mean, they're really kind of they're not as interesting, but the really easy ones are just like, what's been on your mind a lot lately.
Uh-huh.
Because sometimes people will reveal something like big. Um, one person I asked that question to told me I didn't know them at all. It was at a conference. And he said, my wife like might have cancer and we're going through like the process of diagnosis. And he was like, and it was like it was really deep. I think it was very meaningful for him to have that conversation. He obviously would never have just revealed that if I had asked him that question. Um, I was really moved that he shared that with me. But mostly what's really good about that question, like what have you been thinking a lot about lately? What's been on your mind is that it can be something very little and minor and trivial, right? People have a choice to reveal what they want to reveal.
Well,
People will often ask like, "Oh, what made you happy this week, today?" But I like sort of more specific questions. It could be things like, um, what's a family member who really surprised you this year by
mm,
something they did,
mm,
um, what's a mistake you made this year
uh-huh.
that actually like you learned from that was like a good kind of mistake. So there's just kind of a million questions sort of like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and again, you have to kind of gauge. I used to go like when I was going on like a lot of first dates. I hate small talk, right? Like, because it's just to me, it's just boring. I understand you have to
We
sometimes.
did a subtraction series on that. What
Oh
if we
yeah.
just start
Oh,
with
good.
small
Oh,
talk?
subtract
I
small talk.
mean,
I love that you agree with me. So I mean, so I understand it's like a social lubricant at times. It's sometimes like you just connect with small talk, like you talk to the barista or the person, sitting next to you somewhere, and it's nice, and actually you feel kind of good about just being human
yeah.
together. I understand that, but part of me is like I'm done with small talk. But it's also hard to you can't just jump right into deep talk, and so that's why your question is really good. It's like, what do you start with? That doesn't seem too weird to ask.
Right.
Like what's the biggest, well, like one of the questions that's typical is like, when was the last time you cried
Uh,
in front of another person?
yeah.
Um, and I'm not gonna go, ask that question first. But it's kind of a good one.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
so
and I
there's lots
think
of questions.
why not be weird? Like what
Yeah,
we're all weird, sorry, not sorry. Like everybody's
I
weird in
know.
different ways, but like welcome to
Yeah,
humanity.
but I like that. Okay, I'm going to use that word more. Yeah, because when I say about how like we need to sort of show more of our full selves, yeah, like it's okay. And again, maybe because when we're growing up, like we all have those memories of like middle school or high school, right? Like we don't want to be weird, right? We want to be like everyone else. There's a phase that everyone kind of goes through, and
Yeah.
it's sort of painful, those memories, and maybe we want to fit in.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's exhausting, right? Like to be like the person who's different from everyone else. I feel like I'm often like that. I'm like deviant in a good way,
Right.
but it's like sometimes it's just exhausting to be like different from others.
Yeah. And not conducive of
Yeah.
feeling loved from my understanding of your book to really come full circle, right? You got to be weird to be loved,
Right, right, right. But like,
to
yeah,
feel
exactly.
love.
Totally, totally, totally. But again,
You
in moderation.
fair.
Everything in
Fair.
moderation. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so speaking of the moderation piece to
Yeah.
close and bring it home, I mean,
Yeah.
there's so much on the personal relationship stuff. I think your examples, it's
Yeah.
so juicy and rich. And I
Yeah.
think you're clear and just knowing my audience, this work piece is really important. Like I think
Yeah.
there's so much opportunity there. So for a team leader or just a human who works in teams, what's a takeaway? What do you invite them to try this week after
Yes,
hearing
yes,
this
yes. Great, great, great.
conversation?
Well, again, if you think about the mindsets we talk about, absolutely they're so relevant to really almost any kind of situation, but definitely work team situations. So one is, and this is kind of almost obvious, right? For the leader to show curiosity and to listen, right? Again, it seems kind of obvious. We have like politicians doing listening tours, right?
But are
But
they?
but yet it's like pretty rare, like that they really are listening. Like, so when you're telling them about a challenge you're having at work or sort of anything, and to show curiosity, like to actually, how rare is that?
Mm.
not just leaders, but anyone like shows actual curiosity. I mean, I saw a friend the other day who I hadn't seen in a long time, and I realized like he didn't ask me any questions, like really, like he just was not curious about anything, or maybe he wasn't, he didn't know how.
Mhm.
And I was just like, I don't think I want to hang out with this person, like, I mean, again, I don't want not writing anyone off multiplicity, but yeah, showing curiosity and listening and then sharing too, right? So sharing, again, not oversharing, right? But I think we all sometimes we appreciate sometimes when leaders are, sometimes sharing some of their challenges. So like
Mm.
you feel like you're not the only one. And so like we know each other a little bit better, but like with boundaries. I think I
Yeah.
definitely always worry like I don't want to be like best friends with my students or people who work with me.
Right.
And yet we don't, and asking questions, right? We don't ask each other questions. Like sort of one example, I was just saying how like people think it's sort of awkward to ask each other personal questions. So let's say you're at work and let's say none of your colleagues really ever ask you kind of deeper questions about your life and how you're really thinking and feeling.
Mm.
And usually like, and that's true for most workplaces. And usually you conclude, well, that's just like a professional setting. And so people just that they just feel like they shouldn't be asking those questions in those
Mm.
settings. But like you also there's another attribution, which is like no one at work is interested at all in my inner life or in me,
Yeah.
right? And so it can be problematic, right, if we never do that. So maybe there's a way with some boundaries, that we can go a little bit deeper with each other.
Yeah, I love that. Such a
Yeah, yeah,
positive note to send people off on. My
yeah,
last question as we close is, the third part of my three dimensions is the world. And
okay,
not all 8 billion people because,
yeah.
but our world. So you mentioned like a drop of love with a stranger. What's your vision? What would your little hope or dream be for there to be more love in the world?
Great, great. And I think it's really, I mean, it's like a cliche again, but like the world would be such a better place if we felt more love. When you think about like quote like bad, evil people who are doing bad things, right? Like if they could feel more loved, I actually think that might happen less. But I mean, I'd like to apply our mindsets to kind of this polarized world that we live in,
Mm.
like these sort of political divides that we have. Imagine we're sitting across, you're talking to someone at the coffee shop. They're wearing a different hat from you, right? Like they're very different from you. No pun intended, right? And like you really listen to them, right? You show curiosity instead of sort of shutting it off, right? Like I was talking to a reporter who was saying she has these family members who are very different from her in terms of their beliefs, and she loves them, and they just don't talk about it. They just never talk about it, right? And I totally understand, right? To preserve their relationship, and yet, like, imagine instead of not talking about it or just like shutting down or yelling at each other, right? That we actually showed genuine curiosity, like, wow, why do you think that, right? Why do you support that? And like, because everyone has a story, right? And there's actually and also to share about other things that are personal. There's a paper just came out recently that showed that you take two people like really on opposite sides of the spectrum, and each of them shares vulnerably about just their life.
Mm.
They understand each other better, like they have less conflict. So
Mm.
anyway, so I think those mindsets can really be applied
Yeah.
to sort of making the world a less polarized place.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
there we go. That's our
Yeah.
work for the week.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah. Yeah.
that.
Let's try that. Let's try
Let's
that
try
this week.
that.
Yeah.
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 Such a pleasure. Sonia, thank you so much for the book and for
Yeah.
the work and the thoughtfulness and really encouraging people. I'll include information about the book because it really is a beautiful one. I'm a psych major and, consider myself somewhat familiar with all of this and,
Yeah.
an armchair professional in some ways in relationships. But it was really some helpful reframe, right? There's nothing new under the sun, but there are some really powerful invitations, I think, to do the basics a little more thoughtfully. And so I hope it'll change some minds, change some
Yeah.
hearts.
I hope so too. Thank you. By the way, we have a quiz that people can take.
Oh, amazing.
Right, right. That yeah, that they can find out that's on howtofeellove.com, that our website. Yeah, that shows you sort of where you are in these mindsets. So I think that people love the quiz. Yeah.
Perfect. And the book launch, anything else specific where people should find you or know about?
Yeah, just howtofeellove.com, right,
Okay.
is the easiest way, just like the title of our book is the
Yep.
easiest way to find us. Yeah, thank
Awesome.
you. Yeah,
Awesome. Thank
perfect.
you so much. Be well. We'll talk soon.
All right, great. Thank you.